Please welcome our next speaker from Polaris, a global leader in the fight to eradicate human trafficking and to restore freedom to survivors, their Chief Executive Officer, Bradley Myles.
How y'all doing? Good to see you. Thank you for having us today. And this session, we're going to be presenting between Polaris and Delta, and we're going to be speaking on the issue of human trafficking, and we're very grateful to AWS for including this issue this year and featuring this issue, and really thrilled to be here. And so what I'm going to try to do for a few minutes before turning it over to Delta is just give you some real life stories of human trafficking, tell you a bit about an overview of the issue, make sure we're all operating on the same page of what the definition of the issue is, tell you a little bit about Polaris and our work operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which I will show you a slide of, and then also hand it over to my colleague. So, quick warning that this subject is a little bit tougher and darker than some subjects. So just warning for the room about secondary trauma and all that. We're talking about some pretty intense human suffering and some of the darker issues here. So just be aware of that, right? So I wanted to start out with 4 stories, 4 quick vignettes. First story, woman comes from Indonesia to a US diplomat who lives in the DC area, and the diplomat brings her in on a legitimate visa. She flies here to the US. She thinks that she's gonna be working for the diplomat, taking care of kids and caring for an elderly parent and working in the home as a domestic worker. And then when she gets here, she gets her passport confiscated. She is forced against her will to be in the home almost permanently. She has to stay awake and get woken up throughout the night taking care of kids. She's not allowed to call back home to her family. And whenever she tries to speak out about it, she begins getting threatened and told that the only reason that you're here is you're here tied on this one visa to this diplomat. And as soon as you leave that visa, you're then undocumented. And so she's stuck in this home in the DC area, basically held as an indentured servant in a domestic work situation, right? Meanwhile, there's a US citizen kid growing up in foster care, and she has been bouncing around to about 20 different foster homes, and she was removed from her home because there was sexual abuse and neglect in that home. Now she's in foster care and living in a group home with all these other kids. And this pimp begins to approach her and befriend her and show her attention, and eventually claims that he's going to be her boyfriend, gets her out of that foster care situation, and then starts selling her on these online websites where she meets these customers who are buying sex, shopping for sex on these online websites, and then sent to these hotels nearby. She's flown around the country, and she's in this situation with this US citizen sex trafficker. Meanwhile, there's this boy coming to the US from Guatemala. He's fleeing violence in Guatemala. He gets to the border, traveling by himself, sitting at one of the shelters at the border. Someone shows up claiming to be his sponsor and says, hey, I'm this guy's uncle. Can you release him to me? That guy turns out to be a contract crew operator that operates these contract crews servicing chicken, poultry processing, and turkey processing, and egg farms. And all of a sudden, this 14-year-old Guatemalan kid finds himself being forced onto this contract crew in Iowa. And meanwhile, there's a woman from Thailand who gets recruited by someone telling her, you're going to be in this, you're going to come to the US, all you're going to be doing is just massage, don't worry about it, you have to just massage these guys' shoulders all day. And then she gets in this situation, she flies in, she lands at LAX, and then they tell her, you've got a $50,000 debt over your head. You're going to work that debt off by being in one of these massage parlors for the next 2 years. And a taxi picks her up in the airport, drives her to one of these local massage parlors in the LA area where guys are going in and buying sex, and she's stuck in that situation for the next few years, being sold for sex under threat and under violence. And then that case ultimately resolves in this federal bust that happens, right? So think about that. 4 different cases. One, we're talking about a woman who's an adult woman, foreign national, held in a home. Then we're talking about a US citizen kid under the control of a sex trafficker. Then we're talking about this Guatemalan boy who's at these Iowa egg farms, right? And then we're talking about this Thai woman who's in this massage parlor. All those were federal human trafficking cases that broke over the past couple years. So none of that was kind of made up. Those are all legitimate cases, right? So this issue spans race, it spans geography, it spans gender, it happens to US citizens and immigrants, it happens in the sex trade, and it happens in people forced into different types of labor industries. It happens on legitimate visas, like that diplomat visa. It happens in undocumented situations. And so this issue is much larger than we think. And Polaris is an organization that works full-time on this issue. I've been doing this work for about 17 years. And of all the cases that I've worked going out with the police and answering hotline calls, I can tell you that this issue is much, much larger than most city officials realize, most state government officials realize, and most people kind of in our day-to-day lives realize. So the definition of human trafficking, just so you all understand, is 3 buckets. The first bucket is kids involved in the commercial sex trade, any child age 17 or younger being exploited in the commercial sex trade. The second bucket is if you take the broader view of the overall sex trade, what is the subset of the sex trade of people who are held there through force, fraud, or coercion, who are adults? And then the third bucket are all the forms of labor trafficking out there, kids and adults, anyone in some sort of job where there's force or fraud or coercion keeping them there. So 1 bucket for child sex trafficking, 1 bucket for adult sex trafficking, and 1 bucket for all the types of labor trafficking. Those are defined in this federal law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So Polaris was founded as an organization that specifically works on this issue. We work on all forms of trafficking. And we started here in the United States, eventually expanding more globally. We've been doing this work for about 17 years. The estimate is that when you add up those 3 buckets of how many kids are in the sex trade, about 2 million. Globally, how many adults are in the sex trade by force, fraud, or coercion. Globally, how many people are forced to work against their will. You add up those 3 buckets, the total number is about 25 million. That number came out last year. And then you come up with the profits based off that 25 million. The latest economic analysis is about $150 billion. So this is controlling and exploiting other people for profit, right? That's a good way to think about human trafficking. Not notions of movement, not notions of transportation, not notions of border crossing, really notions of exploitation and involuntary servitude, right? So there's a $150 billion criminal industry. And the traffickers right now, they know that there's this huge criminal response to drugs. They know that there's this huge criminal response to terrorism, right? But the response to human trafficking has been anemic. And so the traffickers are perceiving very high profit at very low risk, which is why this is a preferred crime of different transnational organized crime organizations and also criminal networks and others moving into the crime of human trafficking. So the trafficking field that's been doing this work for the past 20 years is already playing catch up to the traffickers who are a few steps ahead, right? So one of the things that we need to do, if we're all sitting here and we heard this morning about solving problems, right? We both need to respond to the problem that's happening of all the people who are in the situations now, the 25 million people, and we need to think long-term about long-term solutions that prevent this crime from happening in the future. We need to be working on both fronts, right? One's going to take mobilizing this response and the eyes and ears and knowing the signs and training the right people and operating things like the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The long-term solution is going to be data analyzing patterns and trends informing different interventions, working with business and government and law enforcement and creating those long-term solutions, right? So Polaris works on both those fronts. So one thing we do is we operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline for the country. And this is the number, this is the text line, this is the chat line. This is the central nerve center of how the country responds to human trafficking. Is this number is marketed across the country. People who are survivors can call in from within a situation. People who identify these situations can call in. Polaris operates this hotline and then is awake 24/7 responding to these calls. We work on about 20 new calls or about 30 new cases per day. It's about 11,000 cases per year that break across the country, and we think that's just a sliver in the tip of the iceberg. And then we mobilize a response of about 3,000 nonprofits across America and law enforcement all across America to create that on-the-ground response, right? So this is a heat map of the cases that we worked last year. And this is, it shows the breadth of the issue. It shows that it really is in all 50 states. And I would also caution you to say this is not a prevalence heat map of how big the issue is in the United States. This is only a heat map of the calls that Polaris learned about and worked on, right? So we're only learning about a fraction of the issue. But we know that this issue is much larger. I'd venture a guess that the number of people being trafficked in the US at any given time is probably over about 500,000. So for many years, this issue has been nonprofits working on it, service providers and groups operating shelters and groups doing outreach to victims and groups operating hotlines and doing case management and legal services and job training and trauma support. There's a whole ecosystem of nonprofits that works on this. And then there's a whole ecosystem of law enforcement that works on this, which are HSI agents and FBI agents and local police and others that are working these cases, right? But we're not going to fully solve this problem with only nonprofits and law enforcement working on it, right? We can respond to it, but I don't think we're going to get to the scale that we need to get to. I don't think we're going to get to the root causes that we need to get to, and I don't think we're going to get to the breadth that we need to get to until we draw the circle wider of all the actors that are working on this issue. So Polaris has done some data analysis on this data set, right? This is last year's data set, but when you add it up, the hotline we've been operating 24/7 for the past 11 years, it's about 50,000 cases. And the 50,000 cases, we then have this major data set, which is one of the largest data sets on trafficking in the country, and we're analyzing that data set for patterns and trends. And we're then asking ourselves, what are the patterns of recruitment? Where is this happening? What are the patterns of types where this is happening? What are the industries where this is happening? How are traffickers evolving, right? If we do one thing to try to respond to them, they morph because this crime is dynamic and it's a dynamic business, right? So we then came out with this one report that said, we now know that there's 25 major forms of trafficking in the United States. It's the typology that we put out 2 years ago by analyzing this data. And the potential of analyzing this data, we think, is only scratching the surface, which is why we're so excited that AWS is really focused on this and interested in this, right? Because the data analytic capacity to really transform this issue can be huge. Then we interviewed survivors and we said, while you were being trafficked, right, you weren't sitting on this own little island, right? Traffickers were using legitimate businesses. So what legitimate businesses were your trafficker using while you were in this situation? And survivors responded and they said, here's how traffickers use banks. Here's how traffickers use flights. Here's how traffickers use ride-sharing services. Here's how traffickers use social media to recruit. Here's how traffickers rent cars and rent hotel rooms, right? And we began to realize that there's a whole ecosystem of legitimate businesses that can play a major role in the fight against trafficking if they are willing to say, our products and services might be being used for this, and we want to take a stand against it, right? I've been doing this work for 17 years, and I remember the times that I was reaching out to business and saying, can we talk to you about trafficking? Are you willing to put this in your hotels and whatever else? And businesses were like, we don't really want to talk to you. That's a dark subject. We don't think our customer base is going to be interested in this. We don't want to be a buzzkill while someone's taking a nice, luxury trip on a hotel. They don't want to hear about human trafficking. And so businesses were kind of keeping this issue arm's length. But one of the things I'm so excited about in the fight against trafficking, especially as it's getting all this attention, right? It's one of the top stories in the country of one of the largest trafficking cases that broke in the country. We're all reading about it in front page news. Is businesses are now at the table in a different way. And certain courageous businesses are stepping up and they're saying, we actually want to do something about this. And we want to acknowledge that our business is being used for this. And we want to leverage the power of our brand and our customer base and our employee base to do something about it. So one of the businesses that Polaris has worked the most with that we're thrilled to be working with is Delta Airlines. And Delta, about 5 years ago, when Polaris approached them with this data to say, look, flights are being used by traffickers, Delta was like, we're all in on this, from the CEO on down. They're like, we're launching a task force on this, corporate-wide. We're going to have our senior executive team focused on this. We're going to be doing listening sessions with survivors so survivors can tell us how we can get smarter on this. We want to partner with Polaris on this. And we've just been really blown away over the past 5 years about how this one corporation has done something really courageous. Like, I'm sitting on flights and I'm like, wow, there's actually a PSA on human trafficking playing on this flight. And that's something that takes courage for a company to kind of step out and do, right? So we wanted to talk to you about human trafficking, get your questions about it, give you an overview of the issue so you understand that it's happening, give you a sense of the potential if we do something about this from a data perspective and we really start analyzing the data and how data can really help us catch up with the traffickers having this head start, and then talk about the importance of businesses being at the table. Delta playing a leading role, but hundreds of other businesses saying, as a bank, what can we do? As a social media company, what can we do? As a hotel, what can we do? And when businesses start stepping up in that way, we get beyond responding to the problem and only helping the 25 million that are still happening now, but we get to preventing the problem where we can prevent the abuse for future generations to come. So that's Polaris's long-term goal, named after the North Star, referencing the Underground Railroad. History and still now, this issue is still with us. What do we do to all stand for freedom and to make sure that our freedom is bound up in others' freedom and that we can be working on this, and this is a winnable, solutions-oriented problem that I hope that you all can think about what role you can play in fighting. So I now want to turn it over, and we're going to watch this one video that was playing on Delta flights throughout this year that I'll leave it at that, and then you'll hear from Joanne to talk about what Delta's doing. Thank you so much.
Hey. Hey. My uncle will get mad if he hears me talking to you. But he's not really my uncle. That's just what he told me to say. He says I'm worth a lot, but he still won't buy me any clothes that fit. Or any clothes, really. All I have is what I'm wearing. He says I'll have everything I need when we get to where we're going. I just hope that wherever we're going is better than where I was. We had to work all the time, and we never got to eat or sleep. And it was worse for the girls. I'm scared. I don't know what's gonna happen or how to get out. But I can't say anything. I need you to do it for me.
If you see signs of human trafficking, text HELP to be free. It's not just a message, it's an opportunity to save a life. At Delta, we've trained over 56,000 of our employees to recognize the signs of human trafficking. But we need your help.
Please welcome to the stage Executive Vice President and Chief People Officer at Delta, Joanne Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. Thank you all. That was a very tough decision for us to make. Actually, Brad, I want to give you and Polaris a great shout out because, you know, through their stories and for our recognition that this is a real story. That was an actor, but real life situation. And when you look at a dark topic like human trafficking, and it's kind of bold and a little bit courageous to kind of step out and talk about it, but how could we not? Brad talked about some stats and said, you know, the $150 billion business, 25 million victims of human trafficking, but 71% of recruitment of trafficked individuals occurs on an airplane, 71%. And 40% of survivors said that during their periods of exploitation, they traveled on an airline. And we're in the largest hub in the world. Atlanta, Georgia is our home state, our hometown. And so we could not stand up and take better, broader action and support the efforts. And then you add to that all these numbers that we have over 80,000 employees, 80,000 sets of eyes and pairs of hands and feet that actually can also kind of support the efforts. And I'll just tell you, and I'm very proud of my company, but I could not be more proud of the individuals that work at Delta, because when they get behind a cause and rally, there's nothing that can stop them. So I want to just talk a little bit about our journey and kind of how it's morphed, and maybe this be helpful as you think about strategies, and all of you are working on strategies for your organizations. I mean, we really started with a lot of tactics. You know, we knew that 8 years ago in 2011 we wanted to do something. I wasn't nearly aware of how prevalent and pervasive human trafficking was until we actually met a lot of partners. But at least we made that first step in 2011, being the only airline and the first airline to sign on a code of conduct with EPCAT. And from there, launched some training to our employees. We joined forces with other partners and made it mandatory training for all crew members of airlines back in 2014. And then in 2015, we met Brad and Polaris. And along the way, we had met partners and kind of made it smarter and better and more educated on the topic. But, you know, Brad said that training, you know, really wasn't enough for us to do. We really needed to talk to survivors. We really needed to get the voice of survivors in our materials, both our training materials, and actually bring them in to talk to our employees. And so we did in 2018 launch with Polaris's help 2016, a cross-divisional effort, not just with our airline crews, but with our ground handlers and our maintenance employees, and really all employees at Delta allowed to get on board, and launched that hashtag Get On Board campaign. Then we partnered with, in 2018, again with Polaris's help, with our SkyWish program. So SkyWish is a opportunity for our Sky members. We have tens and tens of millions of SkyMile customers, the opportunity to give back miles to support many causes, one of them now being Polaris, and to be able to get survivors out of where they are into a better situation. And then, as you saw that video, that played on Delta flights in January, so we reached about 15 million customers with that video, leading up to Super Bowl, which was on February 3rd in Atlanta, and then of course played that again in the month of July during Human Trafficking Awareness Day. So it started with an idea, like let's start with a small thing, and led with partners to marches to continue to build out a strategy and make it broader. So our strategy starts at the top with our CEO. He could not be more committed to this cause. I met Brad actually at a dinner at Ed's house a few years ago, and you know, when you have the support of a CEO kind of leading the charge, it sort of makes it a lot easier to get everybody on board with it. But he also has been really crucial in the Atlanta community with other businesses based there. So if you think about big companies in Atlanta, it's Home Depot, Coca-Cola, UPS, International Hotel Group, and a list of Georgia Pacific and others, and supports and roundtable discussions with the CEO of these companies to say, let's expand our reach. Let's all of us kind of partner together to make the awareness of the subject more prevalent and actually do what we can to end modern day slavery. So I said we started with this one kind of tactic, let's just train our people, but it's evolved into kind of a five-pronged strategy. Certainly employee training is a piece of it, volunteering and getting our employees involved in voluntary efforts across the country, customer engagement, bringing our customers through that video and other means and SkyWish into joining in the fight, supporting legislation. Brad talked about the importance of supporting legislation and making the traffickers, the laws tougher on them, and supporting children, and then obviously leveraging all of our partnerships. So talking about the engagement of the we have 12 different partners. talked about a couple of these. I'll just give you a couple of other examples. So for example, our SkyTeam partners, we have partnered with other airlines. Aeromexico is one. I'll mention that used our training then to train all of the Aeromexico employees. Polaris, as we mentioned, what they've done, but we've contributed, and we just kind of passed the $2.5 million mark, and it's not just throwing money into organizations, it's throwing money into organizations that can really do something important with the funds. Wellspring Living, this is a local organization in Atlanta who we've partnered with to provide apprenticeships and jobs to survivors of human trafficking and helps them get kind of on their feet. And I'll say these employees don't look like other Delta employees. I mean, they've had hard lives, but the stories that they share with us have really changed the lives of Delta people. So the power of helping them get on their feet, but also the power of what it does to us and really the awareness. And then Freedom United is a global organization working with the UN and to try to bring laws enacted in third world countries so that we can kind of join together globally to stop human trafficking. Educating our employees and empowering our employees. The video said 56,000 employees had been trained. We're up to 66,000 employees. And I think importantly, I mentioned that we made it mandatory for airline crews a few years ago, and Delta led the way. But it's optional training for the other Delta's 80,000 employees. And I'm really proud. I mean, our tech ops organization, the mechanics, they are at 100% completion of this training. Our airport workers are almost at 100%. So again, we make it available to our people, and they are supportive, and they'll do it. We hold rallies once a year. We started out when I started working on this cause back in 2012-13. I attended one of these rallies, and there were about 24 employees in the room. We had over 1,000 people, standing room only, at the Get On Board conference we did this year. So we really pack our museum now. There's so much interest in helping. We solicit the help of celebrities. Terry Crews came and others to kind of talk about their stories. And again, it brings more interest to the topic, but it also, having survivors there at the conferences all has had a really lasting impact. We now have 500 employees that serve as advocates and ambassadors across the global workforce and working in other cities that have signed up to say on their time and on their own time to work with local organizations. So I want to show you a video now that kind of talks about the impact of the training.
If we're giving exceptional service, that means that we are taking special care of those passengers that need help. It could be anybody. The perpetrator could be anybody. The victim could be anybody. And our job is to be perceptive as they travel from point A to point B. We know our business passengers. We know our families traveling on vacation. So these potential trafficking victims do tend to stick out if you're looking for it. I had one unaccompanied minor come on who we were going through the regular protocol of, what's your name? Where are you going? He didn't know the answers to very obvious questions, such as who is picking you up when you get to point B? He didn't know. He had no idea. Okay, why are you traveling? He didn't know. He was just altogether intimidated and scared, and it wasn't just with me, it was with other flight attendants, it was with other passengers, it was with the gate agent. He didn't want to look up, he didn't want to speak, and if I thought he was just being shy, then okay, but every flight attendant picked up on it, the gate agent picked up on it, and I couldn't let him get off that plane without someone looking into it, someone of authority taking a second look, making sure this child was safe. Once you understand that you have the ability and therefore the responsibility to stop human trafficking by spotting it, by alerting someone who does know, you take this into your layover, you take this home, you take this to your hometown, you take this on your personal travels, you take it to work, you take it everywhere.
It was Saturday in August, and Jet was down in Florida, in Orlando for some training. Swung into McDonald's and got our food, and we're sitting down. And these two girls walked in that were completely out of place. They were dressed very inappropriately for a family entertainment center. And so I just kind of eyed them and to see what they were doing, and that's how it started. And I saw the guy they were with, and it just didn't fit.
They were around 15, 16 years old. I'd say he was in his mid-30s. Just kind of had a mean look to him, but, I was thinking maybe a family member, maybe something, I've actually never witnessed any form of trafficking. You always hear about it, but you don't actually think that you're gonna see it and witness it in person.
And then they sat down and ate their food.
As time goes on, I notice he gets up, he walks out of the restaurant. At that point, the girls, they start talking to each other, they're being social. So I was like, okay, now I started taking notice. I was like, what's really going on here? When the guy returned, the girls, they looked straight down, they were silent, they just kept to themselves, didn't say a word.
Then the guy get up and he started snapping his fingers, telling the girls, come on, let's go, let's go. And then I looked at Jet, and we both at the same time went, are we seeing what we're seeing?
So I was like, hey, let's call it in. We went outside, I got the plates, make and model of the vehicle. Glenn called it in. A little while later that day, Glenn got a call back from the sheriff, and the sheriff said, okay, well, the vehicle's coming back as stolen.
The biggest thing that I saw was the girls were completely out of place for the environment we were in.
Yeah, for me, it was the interaction between them. It was them being completely silent until he walked away, and then they were talking. We had the LMS training, as we were watching it, I was like, man, I see all this stuff. I was like, is it really that obvious? So when seeing it in person and seeing it line up exactly with the LMS training, that was a pretty surreal moment for me.
Maybe a child who looks lost and a little intimidated. They don't know where they're going. They don't know why they're going there. Maybe there's a young girl who's not allowed to handle her own travel documents, not allowed to use the restroom by herself. There's just a million different ways, a million different things you can pick up on.
Many people might not realize it, but it is very prevalent in today's society, and it is important to try and stop it.
I think it's important to report it, even if it's wrong. What if you're right?
So I think that, when you hear those stories and you realize that we're recognizing this and it's happening all the time, it's sad. It's also gratifying that the more we can get the story out, I think the more we can end. And so we're calling on customers to help with that. We've got the 66,000 employees trained, but as we launch the Get On Board campaign, making those videos available to our customers, working in Atlanta leading up to the Super Bowl, and signage throughout the airport for customers to help join us to spot signs of trafficking. Also working in Seattle, we've just recognized the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for our efforts there. And then donating miles, I mentioned through Polaris. I'm very pleased through the miles that are donated through our customers. Just last week, we crossed the 100th mark on 100 flights of survivors calling Polaris, and we get them out on miles donated by our customers. So we have 200 million customers a year. We think that we can make a big impact on that. So the other way in our strategy is supporting, and Brad talked about this on just legislation, and we've got to do more to make laws tougher on the traffickers and protect the children. I mean, how crazy it was. It doesn't seem that long ago. Arresting prostitutes was our way of kind of cracking down in law, and that's not helpful. That's not going to help us win. So this year was a big year in Georgia. We enacted 3 bills, House bills, that are making the laws tougher on the traffickers. We host regular fly-in events in Washington, D.C. We lobby our capital cities and have over 150 employees that will walk and talk to senators and state and federal. So giving back is kind of core. I mentioned that we have a really powerful group of our 80,000 employees, and giving back is just something that's in our DNA. Servant leadership is one of our core values, and to care and serve others, our communities, our employees. So we are now in 16 cities where we are working with local organizations, and we have our employees have the opportunity to volunteer in those cities. Or they can, we have a great Delta Give Back. We announced earlier that if you want to volunteer in any area, human trafficking, one of us will pay you for that volunteer time. And as I mentioned, 500 people at the Super Bowl, actually, didn't mention this, 500 people that volunteered for the Super Bowl this year in Atlanta. So results by the number, the impact is pretty meaningful when you add it all up together. 6.4 million Sky Miles donated so far, 66,000 employees trained since 2018 only, 500 global ambassadors throughout the world, and then that Super Bowl event that led to 169 arrests over an 11-day period following Super Bowl 53. 100 survivor flights since 2017, and then a 36% increase in calls to the national hotline. I mean, that's a big, and the more and more that we can get that number, and if you all put that on your phone, the more and more that we can spot this, the more we can help. And then 4 apprenticeships that I talked about, and these are giving, and we want to do more of those, the opportunity for survivors to get a chance and to get out of their circumstances from a permanent career. So take action. This is my call to you. It's to get on board with us. Save the number to your phones. There are cards in the kiosks out there in the lobby. Brad's group has flyers, but you can put it on your phone. You can join us in that fight. You can research how trafficking is impacting your neighborhoods. Again, I would have used to have thought that trafficking was really just sex trafficking. The enlightenment of knowing that it's labor, it's adults, it's children, it's broad-reaching. Take action and get informed. Seek strategic partners, and I think this is my big message is that we started out small with a tactic and not really a strategy. It really is through the help of Polaris and others that we have become much more effective in our efforts and having that multi-pronged strategy and making sure that every hour we put in, every dollar that we spent is really working, and it's hard working for us. And then support and learn from survivors. I cannot stress enough what a difference that made in actually talking to survivors, getting their story told in front of our employees, but also informing our efforts and how much better we can do when we really have first-hand accounts and what that means when you hear it from a survivor. And then finally, if you want to donate Sky Miles, because you just have too many you could possibly use, how many actually flew in on Delta for the conference? Thank you for that 5 people. I hope it was more than that, but no, thank you. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank AWS for giving us this opportunity to talk about this very important topic. I really appreciate all of the efforts that you all are doing in serving your communities and serving people, but I hope that you walked away a little bit more informed today after listening to Brad and that you'll join us in this fight. Thanks so much.